Family, welcome to Psychology with me. I am Rashad. Today we will be going over Module 3, Self-Concept, Who Am I? Okay, I have a little experiment for us, all right? A little game. So what it wants us to do is to complete the sentence, I am blank. But we want to complete that sentence in 5 different ways. Again, we're talking about self-concept. Who am I? Answer, I am blank. 5 different ways. And while you're doing that, we'll move on. So, the answers that you've given provide a glimpse into what they call your self-concept. Your self-concept is what we know and what we believe about ourselves. That is your self-concept, what we know and what we believe about ourselves. The most important aspect of yourself is your self. The elements of your self-concept, the specific beliefs by which you define yourself, are your self-schemas. I'm going to say that again because I said self a lot of times here so far. But the elements of your self-concept, and your self-concept is what we know and what we believe about ourselves. The elements of that, the specific beliefs by which you define yourself, are your self-schemas. And what, Rashad, is a schema? A schema is a mental template or mental templates by which we organize our worlds. So schemas are mental templates by which we organize our worlds. A self-schema, by definition, are beliefs about self that organize and guide the processing of self-relevant information. Self-schema is defined as the beliefs about self that organize and guide the processing of self-relevant information. All right, so we started off pretty hot and heavy with definitions and terms and stuff. And if you're not familiar with psychological terminology, which I'm not all that either, but this is coming in pretty heavy. You know what I mean? So let me just go over it one more time, man. I'm sorry if you already know this, but just for our learning, I'm just going over it one more quick time. So remember those 5 questions, I am blank. Those answers that you give provide a glimpse of your self-concept. Your self-concept is what we know and believe about ourselves. It's what you know and what you believe about yourself. That's your self-concept. And we'll get a glimpse of that through how you answer those questions. So, the most important aspect of yourself is yourself. The elements of your self-concept, what you know and believe about yourself, the elements of your self-concept, the specific beliefs by which you define yourself, are your self-schemas. Schemas are mental templates by which you organize your world. They're the mental templates by which you organize your world. A self-schema, by definition, are the beliefs. These are beliefs about self that organize and guide the processing of self-relevant information. And I'm sorry I have to run over that again. That's kind of how I learn too. Like I have to start back. I got to go back a little bit every now and again. We have the luxury of rewind and stuff like that. So I won't be doing that too much, but it's important to know. Our self-schemas are like our perceiving of ourselves as athletic or overweight or smart or, anything else like that. But they powerfully affect how we perceive, how we remember, and evaluate other people and ourselves. So our self-schema, what's interesting about that is that it says our self-schemas. To me, I would think my self-schema is the template for which I evaluate myself. What it says here is interesting, is that it powerfully affects how I judge myself, affects how we perceive, remember, and evaluate other people and ourselves. Like an example of being an athlete. So in the book, what they do is they give an example of being an athlete, and they'll say something like someone who is self-schema is an athlete. They may notice certain things and value certain things that other people that are athletically based, whether they're in good shape, they can jump or whatever. That stuff will stand out to them. That stuff will be remembered by them. And then that will also help. That's a metric that they use to evaluate other people, because that's something in which they identify themselves at, which, you can kind of get on some level. Our sense of self is central to our lives, so much so that we tend to see ourselves on center stage and overestimate the extent to which others notice us too. Because of this spotlight effect, we intuitively overestimate the extent to which others' attention is aimed at us. So we think people are paying attention to us far much more than what they actually are. I know for me, I think about teenagers doing this. And even when I was a kid, you got to wear the right thing. You got to do this, and stuff like this. Little things matter. And from a different vantage point, you're like, nobody's paying attention to you like that. But your sense of self is so, that spotlight effect is so strong that, you just really feel like this is everything. So spotlight effect. The spotlight effect is the belief that others are paying attention to one's appearance and behavior more than what they really are. So the spotlight effect is the belief that others are paying attention to one's appearance and behavior more than what they really are. And in the book, they actually talked about an experiment that they did where they had a party, a social gathering, and there were people there, and somebody had changed their shirt. And at first, the shirt was socially acceptable. And then they did something that they changed up the shirt and put like Barry Manilow on it. Not that Barry is not acceptable, but it's something that they would think would stick out. And what they noticed is that people really didn't notice. So a few people did, but they didn't notice, and they didn't make a big deal out of it. Not anywhere near to what the extent was that someone would project or perceive that would happen. And this doesn't just stop at attention. This also goes into our emotions. So fewer people notice than we presume. But us being keenly aware of our own emotions, we often have an illusion that they are transparent to others. And the same goes for social blunders and public mental slips. I know even, sometimes I would do speeches or do public speaking. I used to feel the pressure that I had to do it right 100%. Then I thought about it, like, they don't know when I mess up. And even if they did, it's not the end of the world anyway. So I can definitely relate to some of this stuff. So yeah, research shows others hardly notice, or they're soon to forget. The more self-conscious we are, the more we believe in this illusion of transparency. So the more self-conscious we are, the more we believe in the illusion of transparency. So one reveals the other. Are you ready to reveal the answers to the question that I asked you earlier? The I am blank. 5 different answers. So, out of the I am blanks, what did you mention about yourself? Of course, I can't hear you. You can put it in the comments or whatever. But if you look at what it is, I want you to see, did you mention personal traits? Like, I am honest, I am tall, I am fast. That's something that we're trying to know. Or did you describe yourself as far as in the context of your social identity? I'm a Muslim. I'm a Christian. I'm a Pisces. I am a insert last name. I'm a Douglas, whatever. So do you define yourself more in the personal realm with personal traits, or do you define yourself in the context of social identity? So in our industrialized Western culture here in America, what tends to prevail is what they call individualism. Now, individualism is when your identity is self-contained. So it's not so much contingent on the community as much as it is yourself. So becoming an adult means separating from parents. It means becoming self-reliant. It means defining one's personal and independent self. Individualism, where one's identity as a unique individual with particular abilities, traits, values, and dreams remain constant. Western culture assumes your life will be enriched by believing in the power of personal control. It's in our songs, it's in our movies, it's in our media, it's in our conversation. Individualism flourishes when people experience affluence, mobility, urbanism, mass media, etc. Individualism, by definition, is the concept of giving priority to one's own goals over group goals and defining one's identity in terms of personal attributes rather than group identifications. Individualism is defined as the concept of giving priority to one's own goals over group goals and defining one's identity in terms of personal attributes rather than group identifications. That's what we have going on here in America. But most cultures in Native Asia, and Africa, and Central America, and South America, they do things a little bit differently. They put a greater value on not individualism, but on collectivism. And collectivism is giving priority to the goals of one's group, often one's extended family or work group, and defining one's identity accordingly in the context of that group. Collectivism is giving priority to the goals of one's group, often one's extended family or work group, and defining one's identity accordingly. Individualism and collectivism also vary across a country's political views and regions. Conservatives tend to be economic individualists. Don't tax or regulate me. And conservatives also are moral collectivists. Legislate against immorality, for example. Liberals, on the other hand, tend to be economic collectivists. Let's pass universal health care. And moral individualists. Keep your laws off my body. Cultures can also change over time, and many seem to be growing more individualistic. Now we're moving on to what we call self-knowledge, predicting our behavior. So in this part of the module, I want you to consider two examples of people's self-predictions and how they can go wrong. One is what they do is they give us an example of movies, of movie watching. So I guess back in the day, Netflix used to allow users to predict which films they wanted to watch next. But what Netflix found out was that the movies that people predicted that they would watch next, they wouldn't watch. They'd end up watching something else. Netflix had a problem. So what Netflix ended up doing is they said, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to predict what it is that we think you're going to watch next. And it worked. So instead of asking, Netflix would predict which movies they were watching that would work. Another example is dating and romance future. So dating couples are optimistic about their future. but friends, they tend to know better. So even though the couple that's inside of the relationship may be feeling a certain way about it, statistically, it's the people who are outside of the relationship who have a better gauge on the survivability and longevity, or lack thereof, of that couple. And so what they say is that if you want to know how long a relationship it lasts, don't ask your heart, but rather instead ask your roommate. It's kind of how they put it in the book. Also, one of the most common errors in behavior prediction is underestimating how long it will take to complete a task. I know I have this problem from time to time. My wife will call me and she'll ask me if I'm out working, how much longer do I think this is going to take? Another hour, maybe 2 hours. 2.5 hours, 3 hours later, I'm like, okay, maybe this was a little. Anyway, so it happens. And so I'm glad to see that it's one of the most common errors in behavior prediction, which is underestimating how long it will take to complete a task. This is called the planning fallacy. The planning fallacy is defined as the tendency to underestimate how long it will take to complete a task. Another prediction factor is predicting our feelings. Many of our life's biggest decisions involve predicting our future feelings, whether that's the topic of marriage, whether that's the topic of our profession, which profession we would choose, even when it comes down to which vacation we'll take. Will that vacation make us happy and bring us the happiness that we want, or give us the relaxation that we want? Will the profession give me the fulfillment that I need? Will the marriage be long-term? Will we make it out? Is this the only person for me, type of thing? So we have to actually predict how our future feelings will be before we make some key decisions. Now, sometimes we mispredict not only our future feelings, we mispredict our future responses. So there was an experiment where they asked women how they think they would respond to harassment, and to sexual harassment in the context of a job interview. The women said that they would respond with anger. But what happened more often is that they would respond with fear. So even in that, they mispredicted how they would respond to a certain situation. So what we talk about next is effective forecasting. So studies of effective forecasting reveal that people have the greatest difficulty predicting intensity and the duration of future emotions. People mispredict how they would feel sometime after a romantic breakup, also after receiving a gift, after losing an election, after winning a game, and even after being insulted. Our intuitive theory seems to be we want, we get, and we're happy. But in reality, we often miswant. People who imagine an island holiday may be disappointed when they discover how much they require daily structure, intellectual stimulation, Cheetos, etc. So again, as we talk about who am I, under the context of this module, who am I think what the author is trying to drill to us is that we may not know ourselves as well as we think we know ourselves. So we move on to impact bias after negative events. So there is what we call a losing of the hand exercise. So losing of the hand exercise basically is a scenario where you imagine that you lost one of your hands. And the question is, would you be more happy, if I get this right, the question is, would you be more happy now or later? And what it tends to say is that what we do is we focus on the negative. So in focusing on negative events, we discount the importance of everything else that contributes to happiness and thus overpredict our enduring misery. Another note is that people neglect the speed and power of coping mechanisms, which include rationalizing, discounting, forgiving, limiting emotional trauma. We tend to adapt a lot sooner than what we expect. Ironically, major negative events which activate our psychological defenses can be less enduringly distressing than minor irritations which don't activate our defenses. Now we're moving on to this last part. And this part I almost skipped, but I'm glad that I didn't. I'm essentially going to be reading this out of the book, essentially. So, it's called The Wisdom and Illusions of Self-Analysis. So, to a striking extent, our intuitions are often dead wrong about what has influenced us and what we will feel and do. We are unaware of much that goes on in our minds. Perception and memory studies show that we are more aware of the results of our thinking than of its process. Analyzing why we feel the way we do can actually make our judgments less accurate. And that's an interesting statement. I'll read it again. Analyzing why we feel the way we do can actually make our judgments less accurate. I would think that analyzing our relationships would make it more accurate. But anyway, it says in 9 experiments, they found that the attitudes people consciously express towards things or people usually predicted their subsequent behavior reasonably well. So, not looking at the analysis, but looking at the attitude that people consciously expressed was a good indicator of its outcome. Their attitude reports became useless, however, if participants were first asked to analyze their feelings. So, if we take these participants and instead of just observing their attitude, we ask them to analyze their relationships or analyze their feelings, the attitudes became useless in the presence of analysis. For example, dating couples' level of happiness with their relationship accurately predicted whether they would still be dating several months later. But participants who first listed all the reasons why their relationship was good or bad before rating their happiness were misled. Their happiness ratings were useless in predicting the future of the relationship. Apparently, the process of dissecting the relationship drew attention to easily verbalized factors that were not as important as harder to verbalize happiness. We are often strangers to ourselves, is what this book concluded. Such findings illustrate that we have a dual attitude system. Our automatic or implicit or unconscious attitudes regarding someone or something often differs from our conscious, controlled, explicit attitudes. Our automatic, implicit, unconscious attitudes regarding someone or something often differ from our consciously controlled, explicit attitudes. When someone says they make decisions by trusting their gut, they're referring to the implicit attitudes. Although explicit attitudes may change with relative ease, implicit attitudes, like old habits, change much more slowly. With repeated practice, however, new habitual attitudes can replace old ones. This research on the limits of our self-knowledge has 2 practical implications. The first is for psychological inquiry. Self-reports are often untrustworthy. Errors in self-understanding limit the scientific usefulness of subjective personal reports. I'll read that again. The first is psychological inquiry. Self-reports are often untrustworthy. Errors in self-understanding limit the scientific usefulness of subjective personal reports. The second implication is for our everyday lives. Even if people report and interpret their experiences with complete honesty, that does not mean their reports are true. And there's an interesting distinction that I've made in the past between honesty and truth. So I think that's pretty dope that they do that here as well. Personal testimonies are powerfully persuasive, but they may also be wrong. Keeping this potential for error in mind can help us feel less intimidated by others and become less gullible. So, one more definition here is the dual attitude system. By definition, and this is a long one, is differing implicit, which is automatic, and explicit, which is consciously controlled attitudes, differing those attitudes toward the same object. Verbalized, explicit attitudes may change with education and persuasion. Implicit attitudes change slowly with practice that forms new habits. One more time. Dual attitude system, by definition, is differing implicit, which is automatic, and explicit, which is consciously controlled attitudes towards the same object. Verbalized, explicit attitudes may change with education and persuasion. Implicit attitudes change slowly with practice that forms new habits. All right, family, now there you go. If you're not tired, I am. So that was module 3. That was self-concept, who am I? I want to thank you guys for showing up. Next up is module 4. I know you're going to like it. It's going to be self-serving bias. I'm going to just spoil it for you. All right, guys, thank you so much. I appreciate you, man.